Dear Dean, dear colleagues, and dear students, welcome to the opening ceremony of the third International Communication, Digitalization and Society Symposium, hosted by İstanbul Aydın University, Faculty of Communication, and organized in partnership with Zagreb School of Business and Mykolas Romeris University. İstanbul Aydın Üniversitesi İletişim Fakültesi'nin ev sahipliğinde Zagreb School of Business ve Mykolas Romeris University'sinin partnerliğinde düzenlenen 3. Uluslararası İletişim, Dijitalleşme ve Toplum Sempozyumu'nun açılış törenine hepiniz hoş geldiniz. This year, with the symposium we organize under the theme of Post-Digital Age, Society, Culture and Media, we aim to bring together academics, civil society and sector representatives, doctoral and graduate students in common discussion era. Bu yıl post-dijital çağ, toplum, kültür ve medya temasıyla gerçekleştirdiğimiz sempozyum ile akademisyenleri, sivil toplum ve sektör temsilcilerini, doktora ve yüksek lisans öğrencilerini ortak bir tartışma alanında buluşturmayı hedefliyoruz. We are living in the post-digital era, a time when digital technologies have fully integrated into our lives. Today, digital is no longer merely a novelty. It has become a powerful force shaping our identities, relationships, and cultural productions. This symposium aims to explore the transformations brought about the post-digital age, from shifts in media practices to new forms of cultural production. We will discuss the opportunities and challenges this era presents. Dijital teknolojilerin hayatımıza tam anlamıyla yerleştiği post-dijital çağdayız. Artık dijital yalnızca bir yenilik değil, kimliklerimizi, ilişkilerimizi ve kültürel üretimlerimizi belirleyen güçlü bir unsur haline geldi. Bu sempozyumla post-dijital çağın getirdiği dönüşümleri birlikte keşfetmeyi amaçlıyoruz. Medya pratiklerindeki değişimlerden kültürel üretimin yeni yollarına kadar bu çağın sunduğu imkanları ve meydan okumaları tartışacağız bu sempozyumumuzda. Our symposium, which we organized for the third time between April 28 and 30, with the theme of Post-Digital Age, Society, Culture and Media, consists of 22 sessions in total, 8 face-to-face and 14 online, where interesting and innovative ideas and papers will be presented. We'll listen to 140 papers and 161 researchers from 12 different countries. Post-dijital çağ, toplum, kültür ve medya temasıyla 28-30 Nisan tarihleri arasında üçüncüsünü düzenlediğimiz sempozyumumuz, birbirinden ilginç, yenilikçi fikir ve bildirilerin sunulacağı 8 yüz yüze ve 14 online olmak üzere 22 oturumdan oluşmaktadır. Sempozyumda 12 farklı ülkeden 114 bildiri ve 161 araştırmacı dinleyeceğiz. In this symposium to be held as a hybrid, in addition to the effects of the post-digital age on journalism, education, art and social life, we will host valuable researchers and their studies under different session titles, such as digital transformation and artificial intelligence, digital communication and political reflections, digital visual culture, digital representation and digital marketing communication. Hibrit olarak gerçekleştirilecek sempozyumda post-dijital çağın gazetecilik, habercilik, eğitim, sanat, sosyal yaşantı üzerindeki etkileri yanında dijital dönüşüm ve yapay zeka, dijital iletişim ve politik yansımaları, dijital kültür, dijital temsil ve dijital pazarlama iletişimi gibi farklı oturum başlıkları altında değerli araştırmacıları ve çalışmalarını ağırlayacağız. Dear guests, I'd like to invite the Dean of Communication Faculty, Professor Dr. Aybike Serttaş, to the stage for the first opening speech of the third International Communication, Digitalization and Society Symposium. Değerli konuklarımız, 3. Uluslararası İletişim, Dijitalleşme ve Toplum Sempozyumu'nun ilk açılış konuşmasını yapmak üzere İletişim Fakültesi Dekanımız Sayın Profesör Doktor Aybike Serttaş'ı sahneye davet ediyorum.
Teşekkür ederim hocam, sağ olun. Değerli meslektaşlarım, sevgili öğrencilerimiz, hepinizi en içten dileklerimle selamlıyorum. Hoş geldiniz diyorum tekrar. Bugün burada dijitalleşmenin farklı boyutlarını konuşacağız. Toplumsal, bireysel, kültürel, ekonomik ve pek çok farklı bakış açısıyla dijitalleşmeyi tartışacağız. Bunun için oldukça heyecanlıyız. Ekip olarak, fakülte olarak 3. Uluslararası İletişim, Dijitalleşme ve Toplum Sempozyumu bizlere dijital çağın zorlukları, potansiyelleri ve etik sınırları üzerine düşünme fırsatı sunacak diye umuyoruz. İçinde yaşadığımız dijital çağ yalnızca teknolojik araçlarla ilgili bir değişiklik getirmedi aslında hayatımıza. İnsan olma halimiz, toplumsal ilişkilerimiz, kültürel kimliklerimiz ve iletişim biçimlerimizin kökten dönüştüğünü görüyoruz. Hepimiz buna şahit oluyoruz. Sosyal medya platformları bir yandan bireyin kendini ifade etme biçimlerini, toplumsal hareketlerin örgütlenmesini sağlarken, bu konuda bir yönlendirme yaparken bir yandan da gözetim toplumunun sınırlarının hızla genişlediğini görüyoruz. Hatta bu konuda bununla ilgili sohbetlerde Black Mirror'a gönderme yapmadan duramıyoruz. Bir yandan bu durumu hala yadırgıyoruz, bir yandan da hızlı bir şekilde adapte oluyoruz. Bu da aslında bu sempozyum boyunca zannediyorum ki vurgulayacağımız ikilemlerden birisi. Bugün artık sadece devletlerin değil, algoritmaların, yapay zeka sistemlerinin ve çeşitli platformların da bizi izlediğini görüyoruz. Bizi izlemekle kalmıyorlar aslında, bizi analiz ediyorlar ve aynı zamanda maalesef ve biz farkında olmadan bizi yönlendirdiklerine de şahit oluyoruz. Veri çağımızın en değerli kaynağı haline geldi. Hem kullanıcıyız artık sosyal medyada ve diğer medya platformlarında hem de bir yandan ürünüz. Bir yandan kendimizi gerçekleştirmeye çalışırken bir yandan da dijital öznenin biz artık performatif bir öğe olduğunu görüyoruz ve bu şaşkınlığı dediğim gibi yaşarken bir yandan da hızlı adapte olmaya devam ediyoruz. Gerçeğin ne kadar gerçek olduğunu sorguluyoruz. Prompt mühendisliği diye bir iş tanımı karşımıza çıktı mesela. Bir yandan da nafile bir çabayla okullarda yapay zekaya karşı tedbirler almaya çalışıyoruz. Yapay zeka yalnızca iş süreçlerini etkilemekle kalmadı. Bu çok sınırlı bir bakış açısı olur. Karar alma mekanizmaları, değer sistemleri, kültürel üretimi etkileyen bir aktör oldu artık yapay zeka. Kodların ve algoritmaların şekillendirdiği bu yeni sistemde iletişim bilimlerinin rolü de hayli önem taşıyor. İletişim bilimlerinin buradaki rolünü şu açıdan değerlendirebiliriz. Biz artık sadece nasıl sorusunu sormuyoruz. Aynı zamanda dijital iletişimin ekonomi politiğini de odak noktasına almak zorundayız ve bu bağlamda bizler ne için, kim için, neden sorularını da sorarak konuyu daha detaylı anlamaya, algılamaya çalışıyoruz. Sempozyumumuzun teması çerçevesinde 121 adet bildiriyle dijital dönüşümün kültürel kodlarımız üzerindeki etkilerini, yeni medyanın etik sorunlarını, dijital göçmenlerle dijital yerler arasındaki kuşak farklarını, yapay zekanın toplumsal uzlaşmayla ilişkisini ve bunlarla bağlantılı pek çok konuyu masaya yatıracağız. Amacımız yalnızca gözlemlemek değil, bu son derece yüzeysel kalırdı. Aynı zamanda eleştirel bir bakış açısı sunmak istiyoruz. Yeniden düşünmek, alternatifler üretmek ve dijital çağın sunduğu olanakları daha eşitlikçi, daha etik ve bence en önemlisi daha insan merkezli bir perspektiften incelemeye çalışıyoruz. Bu vesileyle böyle büyük bir organizasyonun düzenlenmesinde emeği geçen İletişim Fakültesi'nin değerli akademik kadrosuna, değerli idari kadrosuna, burada bulunan değerli konuklarımıza, konuşmacılarımıza ve siz değerli dinleyenlere sonsuz teşekkürlerimi sunuyorum. Umarım hepimiz için ilham veren, ufuk açan, heyecanlı bir sempozyum dönemi olur. Saygılarımı ve sevgilerimi sunuyorum.
Sayın Dekanımıza konuşmalarından dolayı çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Dear guests, as keynote speakers of the symposium, we have three valuable guests with us today. Professor Dr. Cem Sefa Sütçü from Marmara University, Professor Charlie Geer from Lancaster University, and Professor David Berry from University of Sussex. Kıymetli misafirlerimiz, sempozyumumuzun davetli konuşmacıları olarak bugün aramızda birbirinden değerli 3 konuğumuz bulunmaktadır. Marmara Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Dr. Cem Sefa Sütçü, Lancaster Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Charlie Geer ve University of Sussex'ten Profesör David Berry. Our first keynote speaker is Professor Dr. Cem Sefa Sütçü from Marmara University, Faculty of Communication. His speech title is Post-Digital Age and Artificial Intelligence, Being Able to Ask Questions, Not Seek Answers. I'd like to invite Professor Dr. Cem Sefa Sütçü to the stage. Please welcome Professor. İlk keynote konuşmacımız olarak post-dijital çağ ve yapay zeka, cevap aramayı değil, soru sormayı becerebilmek başlıklı konuşmasını yapmak üzere Marmara Üniversitesi İletişim Fakültesi öğretim üyesi Profesör Doktor Cem Sefa Sütçü'yü sahneye davet ediyorum. Hoş geldiniz hocam.
Merhaba arkadaşlar, hepiniz hoş geldiniz sayın hocalarım. Beni de davet ettiğiniz için böyle güzel bir toplantıya ayrıca çok teşekkür ederim. Burada uzun zaman sonra tekrar sizlerle birlikte olmak benim için de çok güzel oldu. Ben size bugün bu post-dijital çağ dediğimiz, dönem dediğimiz, içinde bulunduğumuz diyoruz artık. Böyle bir dönemle ilgili birkaç şeyden, dikkatinizi çekecek birkaç şeyden bahsetmek istiyorum. Burada bildiğimiz gibi artık biz dijital ortamlar deyince sadece hayatımızın bir tarafında duran, ara sıra girip çıktığımız bir yerden bahsetmiyoruz. Benim çocukluğumda öyleydi. Evde bir bilgisayar vardı, oyun oynardık ama işte büyüklerimiz izin vermezdi çoğu zaman. Biz işte fırsat buldukça oynardık ama çoğu zaman gerçek dünyayla bir aradaydık. Gerçek dünyayı yaşıyorduk. Ama şimdiki çocuklar tamamen bunun içinde immersive bir şekilde, yani yaygın ve batmış bir şekilde bunun içine yaşıyorlar. Bundan 2 sene önceydi, yanlış hatırlamıyorsam, bu VR Social'ın araştırmasında Türkiye'de ortalama internete girme oranı 8 saat olarak bahsediliyordu. Bu hayatın 1/3 demek. Dolayısıyla çok uzun bir süre. Şimdi de bir yapay zeka fenomeniyle karşı karşıyayız. Ama bu olayda yapay zeka dediğimiz şey de ta 1980-60'lardan hatta başlıyor. 80'lerde bir kırılma yaşıyor. Yine 90'larda böyle bir kış denilen bir dönem yaşıyor. 2000'lerde tekrar canlanıyor. Sonra tekrar bir unutuluyor, uzaklaşılıyor ve günümüzde de artık herhalde bir daha hayatımızdan çıkmamak üzere yapay zeka ile ilgili kavramlar girdi. Şimdi burada niye post dijital çağ diyoruz? Niye post? Post sonrası demek ya. Ben buna biraz vurgu yapmak istiyorum. Dijital çağ bitti mi yani? Değil mi? Hani artık dijitalden sonra ne var yani? Bu biraz şöyle bir şey. Biliyorsunuz benim hep savunduğum şey de şudur zaten. Sizin de gayet iyi bildiğiniz gibi bütün bu teknolojileri aslında insan olarak biz üretiyoruz. Bunlar bizim birer parçamız, bizim aklımızın ürünü. Biz yaptık bunları. Dolayısıyla ne bileyim bir otomobilde, bir bilgisayarda, bir radyo, televizyonda, internet ne sayarsanız, uydular vesaire hepsi de bizim eserimiz. Sonuçta biz yaptık. Bıçağı da biz yaptık, ateşi de biz bulduk. Ama bıçak ve ateş her zaman değil mi iyi olarak işe yaramıyor. Bazen de maalesef yangınlara sebep oluyor, birini yaralamaya, öldürmeye sebep oluyor. Dolayısıyla burada bizim için önemli olan o teknolojinin nasıl kullanıldığı, ne işe yaradığı. Burada bıçak örneği çok tipik bir örnek olduğu için veriyorum. O da bir teknoloji çünkü, bıçak teknolojisi. Biz geliştirdik onu. Önce el emeğiyle teknik olarak gelişti, sonra teknolojisi gelişti. Şimdi artık fabrikalarda otomatik olarak yapılıyor. Hiç unutmam, Ümit Atabek Hoca'nın kitabında bir sözü vardı. Teknoloji için sosyalleşmiş bilgi tanımını yapardı. Sosyalleşmiş bilgi. Bu toplumun çeşitli kademelerinde çalışan insanlar o fabrika ürünü, herhangi bir şeyi üretebilmek için birlikte çalışıyorlar. Fakat hiçbiri tek başına o ürünü üretecek beceriye sahip değil. Örneğin bir ayakkabı. O ayakkabı fabrikasının muhasebecisi o ayakkabıyı üretemez ama hesaplarını tutabilir. Patronu hiçbirini yapamaz belki ama sermayedar olduğu için o insanları bir araya getirebilir. Nakliyesi var, onun işte dikimi, derisinin bulunması vesaire vesaire değil mi? Bütün bu işler farklı grupların bir arada çalışması ile ilgili. Teknolojiden anladığımız şey aslında böyle bir şey. Teknoloji dediğimiz zaman bu bilginin, ayakkabı yapma bilgisinin toplumun farklı kademelerine yayılması ile ortaya çıkan bir sistemi aslında kastetmiş oluyoruz. Günümüzde bütün bunları yaşayarak geldiğimiz noktada işte yeni medya dedik vesaire öyle bir hale geldi ki artık bu teknolojiden biz kopamaz hale geldik, içine girmiş hale geldik. Ben burada mümkün olursa 3 tane video vardı, onları gösterebilir miyiz acaba? Onları bir sizle paylaşmak istiyorum. Post dijital çağ ne anlama geliyor? Çok güzel örnekler. Eminim ki siz de görmüşsünüzdür bunları. Hı hı.
Mag ik vragen, als ik
Diğerlerini de mi açacaksın? Tamam.
İsveç sağlık.
Hangisini göstereceksin? Şu mu?
Yok, önce ilkinden başlayalım, demin açtığımdan.
Şurada.
Yok, öteki. Hı.
Amsterdam Centraal wil, kan ik dan het
Önce bir durdurayım, ben bir açıklama yapayım. Burada bir gazeteci bir gözlük kullanıyor. Bu gözlük yapay zeka ile entegre olarak çalışıyor ve karşısına çıkan insanların kimliğini, hiç tanımadığı insanların kimliğini o gözlüğe yansıyan bilgilerle öğrenip onlarla sanki daha önceden tanışmış gibi konuşabiliyor.
beste naar
De metro.
de metro, niet de
Ja,
trein pakken?
nee, de metro, dat is vaak sneller. En dan gewoon de Noord-Zuidlijn.
Ja.
Of die naar Centraal Station.
Als ik naar Centraal Station wil, moet ik dan de metro of de trein nemen?
Je kunt allebei nemen,
Ja?
maar moet je er snel zijn?
Ja? Moet ik de metro of de trein pakken?
Nee, je moet de metro pakken. Volgens mij moet je metro 50 of 51 pakken.
50, 51.
Ja, het geeft gewoon aan. Als je rechtdoor loopt, dan zie je de metro.
Ja.
Metro 52.
Klopt het dat je Oorstad die praktijk aan Schiedam?
Ja?
Ja? Klopt het dat je Floor heet?
Ja.
Ja. Van Gunsten?
Ja.
Ja. Bent u Helene?
Ja.
Helene Wachters?
Ja, klopt.
Van Eden McKellen?
Ja, klopt. Zo.
Heet u Wijs?
Ja.
Basharat?
Nereden tanıyor?
Ja.
Oh, wat kan ik jou even spannend?
Klopt het dat u jurist bent?
Ja,
In Venture Capital?
onder andere, ja.
Ja?
Zie je dat?
Ik heb dus een bril waarmee...
Şu, gördüğünüz gibi artık bu tür cihazlar günlük hayata girmiş durumda. Tamam, biraz pahalı vesaire, herkes alamıyor ama bunun içinde çok sorun değil, biliyorsunuz. Birkaç sene içinde Çinliler bunun da üstesinden gelebiliyorlar ve buna ulaşabilir hale getiriyorlar. Bu da bir başka İsveç
Sağlık şirketi, yapay zeka kullanarak semptomlar ortaya çıkmadan yıllar önce hastalıkları tespit ediyor. Üstelik bu şirket, Spotify'ın kurucusu tarafından kuruldu. Neko Health, 70 farklı sensörü gelişmiş yapay zeka ile birleştiriyor. Tarama sadece 20 saniye sürüyor ve vücudunuzun 2000'den fazla yüksek çözünürlüklü fotoğrafını çekiyor, cildinizin her santimini haritalıyor. Özel kameralar, kanın damarlarınızda nasıl hareket ettiğini yakalıyor. Yapay zeka ise bu verileri analiz ederek düzenli kontrollerde kaçırılabilecek sağlık sorunlarını tespit ediyor. Sistem, kalp atış hızınızı ve kan akışınızı ölçmek için lazer sensörler bile kullanıyor. Üstelik size dokunmadan. İlk hasta grubunda yapay zeka yüzlerce kişide teşhis edilmemiş ciddi sağlık sorunları tespit etti. Bu insanların çoğu tamamen sağlıklı hissediyordu ve 50 yaşın altındaydı. Sadece $230 bir ücretle bu teknolojiyi düzenli bir kontrol kadar yaygın hale getirmek istiyorlar. Şirketin şu anda İsveç'te 20.000 kişilik bir bekleme listesi var. Şimdi Londra'ya genişliyorlar ve sağlık hizmetlerini dünya çapında dönüştürmeyi hedefliyorlar. Tıbbın geleceği sadece hasta insanları tedavi etmek değil, sorunları ciddileşmeden önce bulmak. İsveç Sağlık Şirketi.
Evet, bakın bu da olacak, yapılacak, bunlar olacak ileride demiyor, dikkat ettiyseniz. Var. Halen kullanılıyor. 20.000 kişi bekliyormuş sırada bu sistemi kendini kontrol ettirmek için ve $230'mış. Mümkün bir rakam değil mi, aşağı yukarı? Olabilir ki ileride daha da ucuzlayacak. Son bir örnek. Şuydu galiba.
On March 17th, here's the personalized plan of short chair workouts designed for beginners.
In 2023, a Russian commander was assassinated on an early morning jog in his hometown. To plan and execute the operation,
Bir ön bilgi vereyim burada. Bir Rus komutan Ukraynalılar tarafından vuruluyor. Ama nasıl vuruluyor? Şimdi onu anlatıyor. Kendi yaşadığı şehirde vuruyorlar üstelik.
the Ukrainian intelligence service leveraged fitness and locational data from his smartwatch, a GPS-enabled Garmin Fenix 6X. This is the new age of gray zone conflict. In this video, we'll delve deeper into the counterintelligence risks presented by smartwatches, like the Apple Watch. Watches of Espionage is curated by a former CIA case officer with a passion for timepieces. On the WOE YouTube channel, we explore the intersection of watches in the military, intelligence, and national security. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell.
Burada şöyle bir durum var. Bu komutan akıllı saat kullanıyormuş. Garmin marka model orada yazıyordu gördüyseniz. Bunu kullanarak koşu yapıyormuş, bunu kaydediyormuş ve sosyal medyada, daha doğrusu Garmin'in kendi komünitesi içinde diğer koşucularla paylaşıyormuş. Ve ismi açık bir şekilde yazıyormuş. Yani ne kadar enteresan değil mi? Ne var bunda? Ama işte önemli bir pozisyonda olduğu zaman bu kişi açık bir hedef haline geliyor. İşte post dijital çağ dediğimiz şey böyle şeyler. Yani artık hayatımızın tamamen içinde olan şeyler. Bazısı iyi, bazısı kötü. Bakın arka arkaya gösterdim özellikle bunları. Bazısı şaşırtıcı. İlk gösterdiğim mesela şaşırtıcıydı. Şimdi böyle bir aramayı mesela daha önce ben kimlerle karşılaşacağım diye biz oturup önceden internette isim yazıp arıyoruz. Değil mi? Gelen şeyleri okuyoruz. Ondan sonra hakkında bilgi sahibi oluyoruz kişilerin. Fakat burada o anda karşılaştığınız sırada onu gördüğünüz zaman karşıdaki kişiye o bilgiler ekrana dökülüyor. Gözünüzün önündeki ekrana dökülüyor. İşte bunlar çok şeyler. Hani bizim ben X kuşağı oluyorum. Benden öncekilerin, hatta Y kuşağını da belki onun içinde sayabiliriz. Y kuşağının bile çok kolay adapte olup bunlar normal olabilir şeyler diye kabul edeceği şeyler gibi gelmiyor. Ama özellikle Z kuşağı bunu makul görüyor. Z'den sonraki alfa diye isimlendiriyorlar. O kuşakta çok şey görecek. Hani ne var bunda diye düşünecekler. Belki hala Z kuşağı sizler içinizde öyle düşünenler de olabilir şimdiden. Dolayısıyla biz öyle bir zamandayız ki artık teknoloji bizim için bir ayakkabı gibi, bir bıçak gibi gündelik işlerimizin bir parçası haline geldi. Üstelik bunlarda yapay zeka da kullanılıyor dikkat ederseniz. Bu yapay zekanın anlamı ne peki? Konuşmamın başlığında yapay zekanın dönüşümü için bir şeyden bahsettim ama önemli olan burada soruları sormak diye bir şeyden bahsettim. Şimdi biz yapay zekayı henüz o anlamda daha yeni kullanmaya başladık ama bizim için bir teknolojiyi kullanmak, özellikle interneti, sosyal medyayı kullanmak demek, arama yapmak demek. Search. Google'ın işte alameti farikası bu. Milyarlarca, yüz milyarlarca, hatta trilyona da geçtiler yakın zamanda. Doları bunun için, bunu yaparak kazandı. Diğerleri de öyle. İşte Microsoft da böyle, Apple da yoğun olarak böyle. Peki artık aramak yetiyor mu bizim için? Aramak yeterli mi? Artık değil. Neden değil? Çünkü şöyle bir durumla karşılaşıyoruz. Hepimiz de biliyoruz. İnternette bir sürü şey çöp aslında. Değil mi? Hangi bilgi doğru, hangi bilgi yanlış? Bu konuda biz zaten aradığımız için emin değiliz, bilmiyoruz. Bir yol gösterici olması lazım ki bak karşına bir bilgi çıktığı zaman bu doğru, bu yanlış diyebilsin. Bunu bulmak çok zor. Yani bir tür moderatör ya da bir tür yaşam koçu derler ya, işte bak şöyle yap, böyle yap. Mesela demin Deniz Hoca ile konuşuyorduk, nasıl kilo verdiniz dedi bana. Ben bayağı bir kilo verdim son 2,5 senede. Bir 15 kiloya yakın verdim. Bunu isteyerek yaptım. Ama nasıl yaptım? Baktım, internette aradım. Bu ne diyorlar ona, işte aralıklı oruç diye bir yöntem varmış. Onu denedim ve ben de tuttu, işe yarıyor. Günde bir öğün yemek yiyerek bu kiloma geldim. Şimdi ben bunu aradım. Ben çünkü eski kuşak şey yapıyorum, arıyorum, bulmaya çalışıyorum. Bir sürü video izledim, nasıl oluyor, nasıl bitiyor vesaire. Bunu ben hayatıma katıyorum. Bakın dikkat ederseniz bu teknolojiyi kullanarak bir bilgiyi elde etmeye çalışıyorum. Bunu ben zorlayarak yapıyorum. Kendim merak ediyorum, nasıl olması gerekir diye araştırıyorum vesaire. Ben uğraşıyorum. Ama bu sağlık örneğinde, videosunda gördüğünüz gibi bir yapay zeka size bunları söyleyebilir. Bir taramadan geçtiğiniz zaman. Size bir öneride bulunabilir. Şöyle yapın, böyle yapın. Tıpkı bir doktora gitmişsiniz gibi. Tabii burada şöyle bir durum da var. Hani doktor varken yapay zekayı tercih eder miyiz? Biz geçen sene bir araştırma yaptık. Öğrencilerimiz üzerinde. Öğrencilerimiz derken yaklaşık 100'e yakın üniversiteden farklı öğrenciler katıldı. 770 küsur öğrenci katıldı bu ankete. Yapay zekanın mesela bir doktor gibi tedavi önermesini nasıl bulursunuz? Sizin için bu mümkün bir şey mi, endişe verici bir şey mi yoksa diye, tercih eder misiniz diye. Büyük bir çoğunluk şey yaptı. Pek tercih edeceğim bir şey değil dedi doktorlara, insan doktorlara daha çok güveniyor. Ama şöyle de bir araştırma yapılmış. Radyoloji alanında görüntüleme biliyorsunuz. Buradaki örnek de oydu. Bir yapay zeka kullanmışlar. Röntgen filmleri göstermişler yapay zekayı ve tümörleri tespit etmesini istemişler vücuttaki, mesela akciğerdeki. Öğretmişler, bir eğitim verdikten sonra. Yapay zeka bu eğitimi aldıktan sonra ortalama bir doktorun yapabileceğinin daha yukarısında bir başarıyla yeni gösterilen filmlerdeki tümörleri tespit edebilmiş. Yani ortalama bir doktordan daha iyi bir başarı elde etmiş. Tabii ondan daha başarılı insan doktorlar da var. Neredeyse hatasız tespit edebilen. Ama bu bir ortalama doktor seviyesinde başarabilmiş. Şimdi bu şu anlama geliyor. Tamam, çok iyi bir doktor olmasa bile, yani hani süper bir doktor olmasa bile nokta atışı yapabilecek. Ama mesela hiç doktor yüzü görmemiş yerler var, değil mi? Dünya üzerinde, hatta Türkiye'de de bu söz konusu olabiliyor çeşitli branşlar için. O zaman bu araçlar, bu teknolojiler oralarda kullanılabilir. Bu bir fırsat yaratıyor. Tabii bu baktığımız zaman olumlu bir tarafı, ama bir taraftan da şöyle bir durum var. Peki biz nereye gidiyoruz? Nasıl bir hayatımız olacak? Nasıl yaşayacağız? Hani bu klasik örnek Matrix filminde insanları pil haline getirmeleri örneği veriliyor, ama ben daha farklı bir örnek vereceğim. Bruce Willis'in Faces, Suretler diye bir filmi var. İzlediniz mi onu bilmiyorum. Hatta buradan bulabilir miyiz? IMDb'de vardı. Hı-hı. Şuradan o filmin şeyini gösterebilir miyiz? Bu filmde Bruce Springsteen bir dedektifi oynuyor. Ama cinayetleri, problemleri evinde yattığı yatağından çözüyor. Surrogates, pardon. Bu film. Ne yaptık?
Çok kolay. Bu yakınlarda dışarıda masası olan hayvan dostu bir İtalyan restoranı bul ve Can'a gönder.
İşte bu da teknolojinin maliyeti bu şekilde karşılamış oluyor.
Imagine a world where you can be anyone, go anywhere, do anything.
Uzatmayalım, bu başka bir şey. Ne çıktı, nedir anlayamadım ama o filme bakarsınız. Şimdi biraz vaktimi de dikkatli kullanmak adına birkaç şeyden daha bahsetmek istiyorum. Yuval Noah Harari geçen senenin sonunda bir kitap yayınladı. Nexus isminde. okuyanlarınız vardır belki diye düşünüyorum. Ya da okumaya başlamış olanları vardır. Orada bilgi ağlarından bahsediyor. Ve diyor ki artık bizim bilgiyi tanımlama şeklimizin değişmesi lazım. Biz bilgiyi doğru ya da yanlış, faydalı ya da zararlı diye tanımlarız ya. Bu yanlış bilgi, bu doğru bilgi. İşte internette biraz önce de dedim ya, çöp mesela. Bu da bir tanımlama işte yani. O bilgi çöp. Böyle tanımlarız ama aslında bu tanımlama demode oldu. O dijital çağın tanımlaması yani. Peki post dijital çağda nasıl bir tanımlama söz konusu? Şöyle diyor bu konuda. Eğer herhangi bir bilgi insanlar arasında bir network, ağ oluşturulmasına sebep oluyorsa, onları bir araya getiriyorsa yani, o zaman bizim bilgi dediğimiz şeydir. Yani bir işe yarıyorsa, insanları bir araya getiriyorsa, yoksa doğru ya da yanlışsa diye değil. Bunun içinde şöyle örnekler veriyor mesela. Bazı politikacılar yalan söylüyor ama gene de taraftarları ona oy veriyor. Ya da ben onu söyleyeyim, bazı takımlar yeniliyor ama taraftarları onu yine tutuyor. Değil mi? Artık burada bizim bilgi tanımını da sorgulamamız gereken bir durumla karşıyayız bu post dijital çağ dediğimiz dönemde. Yani şuna bakacağız, bu bilgi ne işe yarıyor? Bu bilgi doğru mu yanlış mıdan ziyade bu bilgi ne için bize söylenmiş? Ne amacı var? Ne işe yarıyor? İnsanları birleştiriyor mu, ayrıştırıyor mu? Bunu şeyde fark ettik aslında, Cambridge Analytica skandalında fark ettik. Trump'ın o zamanki söylemleri hatırlarsınız, değil mi? Hep beni işte şey yapıyorlar, başkan yaptırmak istemiyorlar diye başladı. Ondan sonra ben Amerika'yı büyük yapacağım diye başladı. Ondan sonra beni şöyle yapıyorlar, böyle yapıyorlar. İşte bu böyledir. İşte mesela en büyük, en önemli söylemlerinden bir tanesi bu koronavirüs Çinlilerin dünyayı ele geçirmek için kullandığı bir silahtır dedi. Çin'den çıkmıştır dedi. Orası tamam. Ama öteki taraf, değil mi? Buna doğru ya da yanlış diyecek elimizde kanıtlar yok. Bu bir laboratuvardan çıkmış bir virüs müydü? Hala bilinmiyor. Peki bunu bilmenin artık bir önemi var mı? Bu nelere sebep oldu, değil mi? Asıl önemli olan işte o oluyor. Yani dolayısıyla öğrendiğimiz bir bilgi neye sebep olacak? Ya da öğrenemediğimiz bir bilgi neye sebep olacak? Nasıl bir ağ içinde yer almamızı sağlayacak? Bu aslında bizim işte teknolojik araçları kullanıyoruz ama hiç düşünmeden kullanıyoruz. Hiç farkında olmadan ne ile karşılaştığımızı eleştirel bir gözle bakmadan yaşıyoruz, kullanıyoruz. Bu aslında işte o zaman bizim şöyle bir geriye çekilip ya biz ne yapıyoruz dememiz gereken bir çağı aslında ifade ediyor. Burada medyanın çok önemli bir pozisyonu var. Biz hepimiz medyacıyız sonuçta. Bu medyada artık geleneksel medyadan, kitle iletişim medyasından yeni medya dediğimiz bir başka türe evrildi. Aradaki temel fark da şu, bizim kullandığımız bu yeni medya dediğimiz araçlar spesifik olarak bireysel kullanıma yönelik. Bu bireysel kullanım bizim hem bilgiye ulaşmamızı sağlıyor kişisel olarak, hem de kişisel olarak elimizdeki, avucumuzdaki ne varsa her şeyin herkes tarafından, işte örneklerde gördüğünüz gibi, herkes tarafından bilinir hale gelmesini sağlıyor. Eğer siz bir ordu komutanıysanız hayatınıza mal olabiliyor. Ya da işte bir hastalık sahibiyseniz o hastalıktan kurtulmanızı sağlayabiliyor bu bilgiler. O zaman işte biz bunları nasıl paylaşmalıyız? Kimlerle paylaşmalıyız? Ve neden paylaşmalıyız? Bu soruları bir işte geriye çekilip sormamız çok önemli oluyor. Yani bunlara etik değerler diye bir şemsiye altında sorulan sorular olarak ifade edebiliriz. Dolayısıyla bizim bu yeni çağda, post dijital çağda ben bu çağın artık içinde olmaya başladığımızı düşünüyorum. Buradaki örnekler de bize onu gösteriyor. Bundan sonra da böyle gidecek. Ben buradan sıkıldım çıkayım veya işte hoşuma gitmedi buradan ayrılayım başka bir yere gideyim diye bir durum söz konusu değil. Elon Musk başka bir gezegende yaşam, çok gezegenli yaşam diye mesela bir öngörüde bulunuyor, öyle çalışıyor fakat ama bir yandan da nasıl bir çalışma yapıyor biliyorsunuz, Neuralink diye bir çalışma değil mi? İnsan beynine bir çip yerleştirip hep o pandemi döneminde anlatılan korku senaryoları vardı. Öyle bir çiple işte o da şöyle diyor, epilepsiyi çözeceğim ben diyor. Yani o da öyle bir şey yapıyor. O çalışmaları legalize etmeye çalışıyor. Ama bir yandan baktığınızda bugün mesela Graham Bell telefonun geldiği noktayı görseydi herhalde inanmazdı değil mi? Böyle bir şey olacağını. Dolayısıyla ileride o teknolojilerde ne işe yarayacak şu andan kestirmek mümkün değil. Dolayısıyla bizim de çok dikkatli olmamız, farkında olmamız çok önemli. Bir şeyi yapıyorken niye yapıyoruz? Bunu hep sorgulamamız lazım. Ben burada hep genç arkadaşlar görüyorum. Onlar ne kadar bilinçli bir şekilde sosyal medyaya giriyorlar veya yapay zekayı kullanıyorlar bilmiyorum ama bilinçli olmak ne demek belki onu da tam bilmiyor olabilirler ama şöyle söyleyeyim son olarak, bir bilinçli kullanıcı demek yaptığı eylemin sonuçları hakkında hepsini bilmese bile, tüm sonuçları hakkında bir fikir sahibi olmasa bile en azından bazı sonuçları hakkında fikir sahibi olabilen, daha o eylemi gerçekleştirmeden ne olabileceği konusunda fikir sahibi olan insanlar aslında bilinçli insanlar. O açıdan bu eylemin sonucu ne olabilir diye düşünmek çok önemli. Özellikle genç arkadaşlar için. Bazıları da şey diye düşünüyor, nasıl olsa izleniyoruz, nasıl olsa takip ediliyoruz, artık yapacak bir şey yok. Aslında var, onları yapmak çok önemli. Son olarak size böyle bir öneride bulunayım naçizane. Beni dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ederim. Bir 4 dakika zamanım var. Biraz da metne sadık kalmadım ama kusura bakmayın o açıdan. Böyle karşımda bir grup görünce irticayen konuşmak daha şey geliyor bana. Ama temel olarak metinde söylemek istediklerimi anlatmaya çalıştım aslında. Sorularınız varsa cevaplamak isterim. Müsaadenizle hocam. Sağ olun. O zaman ben size bir şey sorabilir miyim? Bu gösterdiğim videolar hakkında ne düşündünüz? Uydurma mı yoksa gerçek mi? Belki uydurma. Öyle yapılıyor, ediliyor falan diyor. Vuruldu diyor işte. Ne bileyim işte o gözlüğü taktım, karşımdaki insanı tanıdım diyor. Sizce bunlar doğru olabilir mi? Ne kadar inanıyorsunuz yani bunlara? Aha. Aynen.
Yani inandırıcılığı yüksek bir sürecin parçası. Hani evet manipülasyon çok açıklı orta. Ama hani konuştuğumuz araçlara bakınca, dünyanın konuştuğu gündeme bakınca gerçeklik payında çok yüksek olduğu insan inanıyor.
Evet. Yani bunların hepsi gerçek olaylar yani. Öyle sorduğuma bakmayın. Aslında gerçek ama size ne kadar inandırıcı geldi onu merak ettim. Onun için sormuştum ama bunlarla daha çok karşılaşacağız. Onun için hepimize başarılar diliyorum hayatta diyeyim artık. Hayatta kalmak mücadelesi gibi olacak bu bir tür. Bu teknolojiyle, yapay zeka ile bir tür bir yandan mücadele de ediyor olacağız aslında. O yüzden hepimize kolay gelsin diyeyim. Beni dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ederim.
Değerli hocalarımıza açılış konuşmasından dolayı çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Bir sonraki konuşmacımız, davetli konuşmacımız Profesör Charlie Geer, Lancaster Üniversitesi'nden. Lancaster Üniversitesi Çağdaş Sanatlar Enstitüsü'nde medya teorisi ve tarih profesörüdür. Şimdi Profesör Doktor Charlie Geer'e bağlanacağız İngiltere'ye.
Kabul etmesi lazım. Orhan hocam kabul etmesi gerekiyor isteği.
Yazar mısın?
Şu an sesi açık ama.
Am I here?
Hello, Professor Geer.
You can hear me. Hang on.
Can you hear us clearly?
I'm just to do this. Excuse me. Speaking language English. My caption language Turkish. Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I needed a right and yes. Is that working?
Yes, we can hear you, but
And
we
have I got-
cannot see you now.
Can you see me?
No, please, can you turn on?
Turn it.
Camera,
Oh, I haven't
please.
got my video on. Oh God, it's a nightmare. Let's try that. No, that's not coming on. Oh, I hate this. Select a camera. I am selecting a bloody camera. Oh,
Yes, it's come. Yes, hello again.
fantastic, good. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Is that okay?
Yes.
Let me just see if...
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Geer, for accepting our invitation as a keynote speaker, and welcome to the opening ceremony of the third International Symposium on Communication, Digitalization and Society, organized by İstanbul Aydın University Communication Faculty. And if you are ready, and we are ready to listen to you.
Yeah, let me just do one thing quickly, just to make sure we're all working. May not be able to do content screen. I'm going to have to quit and reopen, sorry. Oh.
Düşüyor ikiye bir. Bağlantı kopuyor.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Good. I'm
Yes.
joining us. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you, but we cannot see again.
See me? We're nearly there.
Yes, you are coming now. Yes,
Hello.
yes, we
Good.
can see and we can hear you now.
It's amazing. Now, the last thing is see if I can share my...
Recording in progress.
There we go. Share. Allow. He wants to work. I don't have a password for this. Oh, you are screen sharing. Let's hope that's right. Let's hope this works.
And if you want, we can share your presentation.
It says you are screen sharing, but I don't seem to see the right thing on the screen, so I don't know if I am able to screen share. What are you seeing just me on the screen?
Yes, we can see you. Yes.
Yes, I just want one more go. Hang on, just see if I can get this right.
And you can open your presentation on your own computer.
I'm trying to get presentation, but I've got a thing saying email Zoom work. Let's just put my email in just to see if that works. I hate technology. It wants a password, but I haven't got a password to give it for Zoom. I don't know how to get
we can see your screen. Don't you have your presentation on your computer?
I got it on my computer, but I can't share the screen. That's the problem. I've got. Can you see it?
Oh yes, we see now. We see now. Yes, we got it.
You got it. Does it say the hypergraphic unconscious?
Yes.
Ah, phew.
Okay.
Is it now?
That's great.
Good.
Okay. We are listening to you now. Thank you very much again.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence. Hang on, I need just to make sure I've got all the... Bear with me one more second. Forget that. Just forget it. Let's get back to here. I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence. And I'm going to talk about it through thinking about China a bit. So earlier this year, DeepSeek, a Chinese artificial intelligence company, released its DeepSeek R1, a large language model and accompanying chatbot. This has been developed for $6 million, a lot cheaper than ChatGPT-4, for example, had exactly or roughly the same capacity, was open source and used about a tenth of the energy required for similar large language models. So the response to DeepSeek was pretty apocalyptic. $1 trillion was wiped off the value of American and other tech stocks. It was described as a 21st century Sputnik moment, this moment when the Russians launched, or the Soviets launched, the Sputnik satellite.
Excuse me, Professor. Could you little bit volume up, please?
Sorry, hello?
Could you volume up, please? Volume.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Because we cannot hear properly. And could you volume up your computer? Volume, the voice.
I'm sorry, I really can't hear what you're saying. You're breaking up.
And could you volume up, please? We cannot hear you.
No, I can't hear you.
You cannot hear me. Az önce duyuyordu.
Sorry, I've now completely lost all sound.
Hocam onun bizim aldığımız sese bir etkisi olmaz. Kendisi yüksek konuşması lazım.
İşte kendi volümünü açması
No,
lazımmış.
you keep breaking up. Every time you speak, you break
Okay,
up.
please go on now. Please.
Got a higher
Keep
volume.
going, please.
Let's go back. You want higher volume.
Yes.
You want me to speak louder.
If you can, yes, please.
Okay. Is that good enough?
It's enough. Okay, thank you very much.
Good. Okay. So, as I said, the release of DeepSeek was a kind of Sputnik moment. It was also, arguably, the moment at which we saw the beginnings of the so-called Chinese century as part of the rivalry between the United States and China. The point at which the United States was no longer the dominant hegemonic power and that China would seek to overtake that dominance. At the same time, it seemed like a part of a long-term projection onto China as the enigmatic other of the West. This is particularly made clear in something like artist Lawrence Leck's film, Sino-Futurism, which mines stereotypes of Western perceptions of Chinese society to suggest that Chinese artificial technological development is itself a form of artificial intelligence. Now, I have the DeepSeek app on my phone, and as long as I avoid questions about Tiananmen Square, the Uyghurs, or human rights in China, it is friendly, helpful, and personable. And like all AI companies, DeepSeek has made a considerable effort to make the output of their applications look like the product of human-like thought. For example, the actual response to a prompt to the DeepSeek, as in the same with ChatGPT or Claude, is nearly instantaneous, but delays are built in, including the scrolling of text as if being typed in real time to give the illusion of thought taking place at a human temporal scale. And of course, we all know that AIs do not think or understand in human terms, or what we think of as human terms. Large language models are just, to use my friend Richard Harper's phrase, word geometry engines and nothing more. And what they do, in effect, is make vast analyses of the statistical distribution of words over the large corpuses of language made available through the World Wide Web. So when we ask a question of a large language model, what it does is find the most likely, statistically likely response, the next word that will come as an answer to that question. There is no understanding in the sense that we think we understand it. So, as many people have explained, interacting with a large language model gives us a very compelling illusion of being in the presence of a thinking creature like us. We think we are addressing something like a human being, even though we know, or we should know, that what an AI does is very, very different, or at least we think it's very different. The idea that we are conversing with a human goes back to the very beginnings of artificial intelligence as an idea in Alan Turing's famous seminal paper, Computer, Machinery and Intelligence, published in 1950, in which he developed the idea of the imitation game, in which he said, he starts off imagining a situation in which a man and a woman both communicate with a third party, another man, and the first man's job is to persuade the man receiving the communications that he is also a woman. And Turing's claim is that if he can persuade the man that he is a woman in terms of this kind of discussion, he is. And he transposes the same idea to a machine, saying that if a machine can persuade us that it has consciousness, then it does. By the way, interacts with us. So from the very beginnings of AI, this idea of communicating with us in a human sense was very important. But crucial to that idea was the fact that Turing's model uses a teletype machine, a machine which we type into, like a typewriter, which communicates through written, or I should say typed language. And it is absolutely part of our alphabetic way of thinking that makes us, when we read a piece of writing, that makes us almost hallucinate that there is some speaking subject that is issuing forth the language communication. This is what Melanie McMahon claims in her book, The Violence of the Letter, that we always hear a voice in our head when we read writing. So immanent within the way artificial intelligence works is the idea that we are using a language system that makes us believe we are communicating with another subject with consciousness. Now, this is interesting for me in particular, given that one of the major players in social media artificial intelligence, the company originally known as Google, now quite straightforwardly calls itself Alphabet. And I don't think they're conscious of some of the implications of this, but I do believe this is really quite important. Now, interestingly, one of the great critiques of artificial intelligence was by the philosopher John Searle in the so-called Chinese room thought experiment, in which he imagined somebody in a room with a series of instruction books that gave instruction to do when he got an input coming from outside of some squiggles, Chinese writing, which he doesn't understand, and instructions of what outputs to give when receiving those squiggles, with more squiggles, more bits of Chinese writing. Searle's claim is that a computer, an artificial intelligence system, does no more understand the world than the man in the room understands Chinese. It is merely doing some instructions that is being given mechanically, but it gives the appearance of thinking. So this is a way in which, in a sort of strange way, Chinese comes back into our phantasmatic understanding of artificial intelligence. But I want to delve into this a bit and think about whether, in actual fact, the way we think is much closer to how artificial intelligence works than we would care to think in the first place. And in order to do so, I want to turn to the work of the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, and in particular, some of his early work, in the 1950s, when Lacan was giving the first few of a series of his seminars, in which over a year he would discuss various aspects of psychoanalysis. In Seminar 2, The Ego in Freud's Theory and Technique of Psychoanalysis in 1954-5, Lacan presents what is a kind of materialist definition of the phenomenon of consciousness. And he offers us a model. I've shown you a screen grab of the actual part of the seminar when he talks about this, in which he talks about the idea of a consciousness that is not connected to the human ego. And I'm going to give you a quote here. He talks about a mirror. One of the major ideas is that for him is that consciousness can be thought of like a mirror. And then he says, what is the image in the mirror? The rays in which return onto the mirror make us locate in an imaginary space the object, which moreover is somewhere in reality. The real object isn't the object that you see in the mirror. So there's a phenomenon of consciousness as such. That, at any rate, is what I would like you to accept. So I can tell you a little apologue to aid your reflection. Suppose all men have disappeared from the world. That is already to raise the question, what is left in the mirror? But let us take it to the point of supposing that all living beings have disappeared. There are only waterfalls and springs left, lightning and thunder too. The image in the mirror, the image in the lake, do they still exist? And he suggests that it's quite obvious they still exist, for one very simple reason. At the high point of civilization we have attained, which far surpass our illusions of consciousness, we have manufactured instruments which, without in any way being audacious, we can imagine to be sufficiently complicated to develop films themselves, put them away into little boxes and store them in the fridge. Despite all living beings having disappeared, the camera can nevertheless record the image of the mountain in the lake or that of the Café de Flore crumbling away in total solitude. So my friend and colleague Arthur Bradley suggests that this passage shows that Lacan is not interested in whether machines can be conscious, an issue to which he is supremely indifferent, but rather that for him, human consciousness is itself a kind of machine. Because of the existence of cameras, Lacan implies, we must learn to recognize ourselves anew. We human beings never actually disappeared from the world at all, but only because we were never really there in the first place, because human consciousness is itself a species of automatic photography, because we are the camera. This is part of Lacan's attack on the prevalent ego psychology in post-war psychoanalysis, which sought to restore the integrity of the ego, which Lacan saw as an object that exists at the level of the imaginary. And the image, by the way, is from the experimental filmmaker Michael Snow's film La Région Centrale, made with a camera with a pre-programmed robotic arm, which is a totally automatic recording of the environment in which the camera finds itself. What interests me in this passage in particular is Lacan's choice of scene, where he describes the lakes and the mountains and the lightning, which strikes me as far from arbitrary. My belief is that Lacan was deliberately conjuring up images that are found in Chinese poetry and painting, and that his materialist definition of the phenomenon of consciousness is influenced by his profound engagement with Chinese thinking. For example, the waterfall he talks about, is a key figure in Tang dynasty painting. A quick Google search gives me the beautiful painting in the Shan Shui or mountain water style by the great Tang artist and poet Wang Wei. This is a picture you can see on the screen of a waterfall. And Lacan's invocation of the mountain in the lake seems to me, at least, to be an allusion to the Taoist Buddhist ideas of mountain and water. And this is not as surprising as it might at first appear. Lacan once remarked that perhaps I'm only Lacanian because I did a bit of Chinese back in the day. During the war, Lacan given up any psychoanalytical practice and studied classical Chinese at the École des Langues Orientales under the sinologist Paul Demiville. His work is permeated with references to Chinese language and ideas, especially in the 1970s, where he worked with a Sino-French scholar, François Cheng, on translations of classical Chinese texts. Their relationship was so intense that Cheng had to withdraw from Lacan's continuous questioning at any time of the day or night about Chinese culture and thought in order to write his own book on Chinese poetry. And Chinese ideas and writing are to be found all the way through Lacan's writing and his later seminars. For example, he mentions François Cheng and Chinese poetry in Seminar 24 to unpack his understanding of poetry as imaginarily symbolic. For Lacan, it is that Chinese poetry is written that makes it exemplary of poetry as close to the analytic act. So he finds within poetry the paralinguistic elements that he sees as also being key to psychoanalysis, and particularly in Chinese poetry because of its extreme compression and its refusal of things like the first person singular, the I. In his account of his conversations with Lacan, Cheng describes in leafing through Cheng's recently published book on Chinese poetry and picking out a poem by Wang Wei, the same person who painted the waterfall, entitled Lake Yi. And there it is, it's on the top right of the screen, with flute song to the shore as sunset, see you off. On the lake, turn back an instant, white clouds embrace green mountain. Adrian Price, the Lacanian scholar, gives a very convincing analysis of this poem in terms of Lacan's understanding of sexuation. But the poem that interests me far more in Cheng's book is another one that Cheng writes about, which is Deer Park, on the top right again, which the literal translation there, empty mountain, none to be seen, but hear the echoing of voices, returning shadows enter deep, the grove, sun shines again on lichens green. And the point of this is a poem without a human subject. Many English translations or translations of European languages do tend to make it appear as if there is an I here. But the true way the poem works, sorry, I was just getting something coming through my thing, is without there being any subject to, as it were, be present to the phenomena taking place. Xu Xiaoquan suggests that Lacan, free of professional academic dogmas in matter of linguistics, was able to take a fresh look at Chinese, especially its writing, where he discovered a system of meaning that would reveal, in his eyes, the subtle mechanism of the unconscious. This is, claims Chu, in part because Chinese writing differs in its complexity from the almost transparent simplicity, the hallucination quality I was talking about earlier, of alphabetic writing. And this is a quote from Chu. Certain original features of Chinese, and even more of Chinese writing, could inspire a vision of the subject that would be out of step with the concept of the subject in the Western philosophical tradition. The voice of the language necessarily emanates from the person speaking the word I, the subject of the sentence, eminently marks the presence of a subject, the sovereign and divisible author of all thought and all discourse. Coming to Chinese, on the other hand, we would note another system, whose subject is noticeably off-centre and even elusive. I won't read the rest of the quote, but the point here being that Chinese offers a different notion of subjectivity. And this takes Lacan back to one of his great points of influence, which is going back to read Freud properly. And he reminds us in the famous Rome discourse of Freud's point that in the Traumdeutung, the interpretation of dreams, Freud's classic book of 1901, that he sees the figures, the visual elements in a dream as being rebuses that are closest to hieroglyphs, or, as Freud puts it, the characters still used in China. So there is something relationship for Freud and Lacan between some of the ways that we think of Chinese writing and the ways we can engage with the unconscious. In the same seminar where Freud talks about the Mountain Lake, he invokes a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, The Purloined Letter, which deals with the circulation of a letter that has been stolen from the Queen by one of her ministers and hidden in plain sight, and then returned by the detective Dupin, and who also finds it hiding in plain sight in the minister's room. And it's about, for Lacan, this is an exemplary story about the circulation of the sign among subjects beyond its ostensible meaning. But what Lacan is really interested in this story is the way it helps us understand Freudian repetition automatism, Wiederholungswang, based on the insistence of the signifying chain. For Lacan, it is the letter, purloined and returned, that is the true subject of the tale, which maps the detours and circular path to arrive at its destination. And the detours and paths of the signifier are part of the repetition compulsion that Freud analysed in terms of the death drive in his book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is a compulsive search for the lost object manufactured in the infant's famous Fort Da. This is the point where Freud observes his grandson throwing a cotton bobbin out of his pram, rolling it back on a string, and then when he throws it out, shouting for gone, and then bringing it back, going da for away, for here. This, for Freud, is the primal scene of mastering the absence of the mother in terms of a binary between absence and presence, which constitutes our entire relation to the signifying chain. And it is in this that that Lacan really tries to understand the way in which signification emerges out of this presence-absence process, this continual meaning going between presence and absence. In the same seminar, I won't go into this in any great depth, but Lacan tries to bottom out the very basis of signification through looking at the apparently random games that he is interested in, including games of flipping coins in which you get an entirely random set of heads and tails, which he then transposes into plus and minuses, and shows how once you start to understand them in terms of probabilities, you are leaving the realm of the real, that of the randomness of the coin tosses, and entering the realm of signification. And that signification emerges out of this kind of presence-absence process or drive that's in the real. He plays other games as well in the same seminar, in which he works out complex ways in which apparently random games of chance turn out to be amenable to being structured according to ways they're codified, which he sees really as the basis of signification, as a emerging out of the repetition compulsion that he sees as being the primary way in which we deal with the presence and absence of the carer, and therefore enter into the signifying chain. Now, what is interesting about this, as many commentators have pointed out, is that the time Lacan was writing this, he was very engaged with the then powerful and important ideas coming out of cybernetics. And Lydia Liu goes so far as to suggest that he's delineating in this work a kind of cybernetic unconscious, the post-war Euro-American world order, which gives us a different understanding of Lacan to that we normally get of that somebody mostly indebted to the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jacobson, and instead sees Lacan really dealing with the kinds of issues around technology, techniques, tools, feedback, and so forth, that are absolutely part of post-war cybernetic thinking, that were also the same context in which Alan Turing was thinking about thinking machines, and which people like von Neumann and Morgenstern were thinking about games theory. And Liu and John Johnson and others show how Lacan is really deeply engaged in the kind of post-war game theory that's also fundamental to people thinking about things like the structure of computers, like artificial intelligence, and like things like mutual assured destruction in the Cold War. And so Lacan is a very important figure, I think, for actually rethinking how we engage with some of our current issues in technology. The other comparison that Liu particularly makes is based on some allusions that Lacan makes, is that Lacan was also clearly thinking about the famous Chinese book of, I don't know quite how to put it, it's not a fortune-telling book, it's much more important than that, but the book of engaging with the cosmos known as the I Ching, in which different combinations of the binary units of broken and unbroken lines are combined in hexagrams to create 64 different possible outcomes to any particular situation. And in the Rome discourse, Lacan mentions this very thing and clearly understands our entry into the symbolic, into signification, as being something like the binary opposition of the I Ching, as resembling very much the Fort Da, the here and there, the gone and here, that actually is the basis of our entry into signification. And indeed, in a later seminar, in the seminar 11, Lacan discussed how Chinese astronomy is based on the play of the signifiers that reverberate from top to bottom in politics, the social structure, ethics, the regulation of slightest acts, and that it is nevertheless a very fine astronomical science. And up to a certain point, all the reality of the heavens may be inscribed in nothing more than a vast constellation of signifiers. I won't talk about Yuk Hoi, though it's very interesting. But just to point out that, of course, it is also the I Ching that was seized upon by Gottfried Leibniz in the 17th century, as the inspiration for his own development of the binary notation that, of course, is the basis of computing, as many people have pointed out. The thinker who has taken the cybernetic aspects of Lacan most seriously, most early on, is probably Friedrich Kittler, particularly in his book Gramophone Film Typewriter and some of the essays there, in which he directly compares the Lacanian structure of the symbolic, the imaginary and the real to the various media that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century, and in particular sees the symbolic as being very much aligned to the typewriter as a technology of the discrete symbol that inscribes itself on the kind of unconscious. And so how the typewriter in particular foregrounds the kind of autonomous nature of the signifier and the letter. By the way, the typewriter in this image is, of course, the one that Nietzsche owned, though he didn't really use because he was so blind, and which led him to say that our writing instruments determine our thoughts. In 1947, 3 years before Turing's famous paper and 7 years before Lacan's second seminar, the Chinese novelist Lin Yutang unveiled his Ming Kuai Chinese typewriter, the work of nearly 2 decades of research. This was the first device to solve the problem of making the typewriter keyboard manageable for Chinese. Early attempts at making Chinese typewriters had relied on vast trays of individual characters to be selected by highly trained users. The Ming Kuai used a small keyboard similar to the standard Western QWERTY keyboard, but used it to offer the user different possible characters in a small window. Though development of this typewriter was put an end to with the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, it was crucial for later developments, particularly that development of input method editors, which are the current way of using typewriters and word processors in China. There's just a picture of a Chinese typewriter before the Ming Kuai, showing the cumbersome and almost impossible nature. That's a tray full of thousands of characters. From the Ming Kuai typewriter through to the development of Chinese computing and the development of laptops, enormous strides were made in China in using standard QWERTY keyboards as ways of helping the user generate thousands of different Chinese characters. And this is known as the input method editor. And this has been written about very well by the historian of technology, Thomas Mullany, in his 2 books, The Chinese Typewriter and The Chinese Computer. Roughly what happens is that the user can use the QWERTY keyboard to generate a choice of different possible Chinese characters, and an experienced user can do this extremely quickly, in fact, far quicker, it is claimed, than a QWERTY user can use the QWERTY keyboard to generate words. According to Thomas Mullany, this means that for the first time in history, the supremacy of the alphabet as the most efficient linear system of inscription has been overtaken by the capacity of the input method editor. And in Mullany's words, QWERTY is over. And finally, just to, but I've lost my, excuse me, I've managed to lose my page here. Mullany, who is a Stanford professor of Chinese history, has been particularly interested in developing an idea he calls hypographics, which means writing under. And he sees the input method editor as being a totally new way of thinking about writing that goes away from the sort of one-to-one correspondence between the character, the key and the keystroke in the normal typewriter through to the Western word processor, and offers an almost infinite possibility of varieties, a kind of fluid world of words, or cosmos of words, underneath the typewriter, underneath the keyboard, in a way that completely changes our relationship to language. And as this article about Thomas Mullany says here, he believes that this new way of thinking about our relationship between our technologies of inscription and the way we think about how we think, and things like AI, has been massively developed through these kinds of Chinese technologies.
Excuse me, Professor, we have got very little time left. And
this is my last slide. I'm done.
Oh, yes. Okay, thank you.
I'm absolutely done. So let me show. I was just on the verge of my last moment. There we go. Done.
Now, you're finished now?
Yes, I finished.
Thank you very much for your speech and for your participation. And hope to see you in Istanbul sometimes in the next future. And can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for your speech and for your participation to our symposium.
I can hear you.
Okay. And sometimes in the next future, we hope to see you in Istanbul. Now, and we have got the final keynote speaker of the opening ceremony is Professor David Berry from Digital Humanities, University of Sussex. And now we will connect to England again for Professor Berry. And would you like to stay with us to listen to Professor Berry, or would you like to leave?
I'll listen to David.
Okay, thank you very much.
but I don't want to be host anymore.
Okay.
Hi, David.
Hello. Is it working?
Yes, it's working. We can hear you, but we cannot see you now.
Oh, I can. My video.
Hello, Professor David Berry.
Hello. Nice to see you all.
And nice to see you too. Thank you very much again for accepting our invitation as a keynote speaker. Welcome to the opening ceremony of the third International Symposium on Communication, Digitalization and Society, organized by Istanbul Aydın University. And we'll listen to Professor David Berry with the topic of Understanding the Post-Digital, Artificial Intelligence and the Computational Turn. And if you are ready, David Berry, and we are ready to listen to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak today.
And first of all, could you volume up your computer, please?
Could I?
Yes, we cannot hear you properly. And turn up the volume of your computer.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
Hello.
Is it working okay?
Yes, it's working, but your sound is just a little bit less. And can you make it higher, please?
I will try to
or maybe you can try to speak up.
Yeah. Hang on a second. Sound. How's that? Is that better?
Much better. Yes, thank
Good.
you.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much again. We are listening to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to come and talk. It's always a privilege. And of course, hello to Charlie as well. Good to see you. Haven't seen you in a while. Today, I'm going to be talking about understanding the post-digital, but it's very specifically in terms of the turn towards generative AI and understanding the way in which the post-digital can both help us understand this contemporary turn, what I call the synthetic turn, and place artificial intelligence and computational methods within a particular kind of media theoretic framework. So I just want to set up a number of questions that I'm going to be touching on in some way. It's obviously a very short talk, so I won't be able to address all of these. But some of the things that drive the research that I'm interested in include, for example, how we maintain human agency, particularly in a world which is increasingly becoming automated through algorithms and, of course, particularly through, more recently, artificial intelligence. The next question, which I'll try to talk to towards the end, is really how questions of resistance can be articulated. How can we present a challenge to these kinds of problematics, particularly the overly automated, bounded systems that are increasingly becoming part of our everyday life? And next, I want to think about, or at least gesture to, ethical frameworks for thinking about synthetic media in particular. The rise of synthetic media is obviously a very contemporary issue and one that has very much been driven to the front of our attention quite recently. And consequent to that really is, which is in some senses drawing on similarly on work of Frederick Kittler and I think complements Charlie's presentation very well, this question of human experience when mediated through particular media technologies. And then I suppose we have to think about the role of the state in this new generative AI world and questions about regulation, about limits and bounds and how they might play out in the future. So I'm going to talk in three sections. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the post-digital and how we might think of it. Then I want to talk about the shift from the computational as the problematic to the synthetic, and particularly the role of what I call diffusionization. And then lastly, I want to think about some questions of synthetic media and how we can think through some of the implications that it raises for us. So firstly, in terms of the post-digital, it's important to understand there are various articulations of the post-digital. And the kind of articulation I think is interesting to think about today really is not really a kind of temporal one, which is that somehow we are after the digital, as if the digital was a historical moment and we move to various other kinds of historical understandings. That is, the post-digital is not, as it were, epochal. But rather it's a kind of intensification of the digital. It's actually a qualitative transformation in the way in which the digital is both approached, used and the way in which it transforms our economies, our societies, and of course our consciousness in various ways. And I argue that in some ways this generates what I call the algorithmic condition, which is that our ways of seeing, as it were, are increasingly mediated in and through computational concepts, computational ideas, and of course through the lenses of the computational as well, both figurative and literal. And I want to suggest that this implies a movement in the way in which our consciousness is formed from one of a tendency towards a kind of false consciousness to post-consciousness, and I'll go into some detail on that in a little while. But also, I want to draw on and use the notion of porosity, developed particularly by Walter Benjamin, to think about the way in which computation actually, we tend to think about computation as a discretization technology, but actually it's the porosity that is most interesting and I think challenging with these new LLM-type generative AI systems. Now, in the moment of the algorithmic condition, what I'm going to suggest is that we can understand it through both subjective and objective dimensions. For me, post-consciousness, therefore, represents the kind of social, individual, or psychological change that takes place under these conditions, as opposed to the more objective conditions that are seen, for example, in social structures, political economy, and so forth, which I term the inversion. The inversion is an idea that at some point we have entered a situation where, because of the vast quantities of computer-generated and particularly synthetic materials that are increasingly generated by our computing systems, they are beginning to actually overload, if not flood, our ability to deal with them, to understand them, to work with them, and thereby start to erase the boundaries in rather interesting ways between the computational and the human, as it were. And these two concepts then attempt to capture this kind of objective and subjective moment, this kind of historical process which we're currently living through, in which what I call probabilistic media is particularly configuring cultural production for the purposes of a kind of a media theoretic intervention, but also I think more generally industrial and informational production, and of course the forms of consciousness that would be expected to emerge from that. Now, one side of this is I think that we're increasingly moving towards a kind of post-screening culture. We see this in our conversational interfaces that are increasingly emerging, not just textual, but oral. We're seeing the way in which computation itself is being embedded in everyday objects, the widespread use of smartness, and of course, with the declining cost of computation and chips, what we have seen is the most mundane object, such as a light bulb, increasingly has a chip within it and the ability to network, and thereby the ability to connect to cloud-based AI systems. And of course, that allows this interaction with objects that is rather kind of strange, but essentially mediated through computational forms. Nonetheless, people continue to increase their phone use, increase their use of various forms of computational device. And we can think of these kinds of surfaces as it were, theatres of action, where people are living out their lives in various ways with various kinds of consequences, most notably, I think, in terms of the consequences for attention. Jonathan Haidt talks about the notion that we have this kind of problematic of the anxious generation due to the overemphasis on screening culture, and I think particularly in relation to post-screening culture, that may well be a further problem. But we also, I think, can read this movement in terms of media theoretic media objects that are left as traces in our everyday lives. So we can see, for example, the way in which the digital and the historical notions of the digital start to inform our cultural memory in very interesting ways. And I haven't really got time to talk about that, but it's kind of an interesting aspect of the post-digital. And I'd also suggest that in some ways what we have is an increasing tendency to focus on the surface rather than depth models. You see this in terms of, for example, the critique of the algorithm, which I find quite fascinating. The algorithm stands in, as it were, for a kind of hermeneutics of the surface rather than a hermeneutics of suspicion. Again, kind of an interesting sort of pathology, if you like, of a contemporary social condition. So next I want to talk about this notion of diffusionization. Now, artificial intelligence, I think, is very interesting in many different ways, but one thing that I find particularly fascinating is the way in which, due to the structural constraints of the design and implementation of these systems, they make possible, I would argue for the first time, a particular kind of algorithmic genesis through the use of historical forms of culture, particularly human-based culture, which allows the, now I hesitate to say reproduction, but the reconstruction of new cultural media objects. And of course, this also includes material objects too, which I haven't really got time to talk to in this lecture, though I have a quick slide to show you. And so what I want to suggest is this is a shift from digital reproduction, so the digital, as it were, as a storage medium, of course, following the kind of classic critiques of the digital as one that is discrete and able to reproduce with a high degree of fidelity, to one of computational generation. And this, I think, has interesting parallels with Marx's notion of real subsumption, that what we're seeing is a move operating at the level of cultural production. Now, this process of real subsumption then, through this diffusional model that I think is increasingly active, is interesting because what we're seeing is that diffusionization allows the dissolving of cultural form in really quite strange and interesting ways. And in the dissolving and reconstruction of those cultural forms, what you get is a certain kind of algorithmic novelty, if we could be able to use that sort of term, that the systems themselves become, as it were, somewhat persuasive, of course, but also seem to be increasingly creative. And of course, this we know this from seeing how, for example, students increasingly turn to these generative AI systems to constitute their essays. We see it in, for example, advertising, where increasingly copywriting is performed through ChatGPT searches. Allegedly, the Trump administration's tariff policy was generated using ChatGPT. And we see this in so many different ways that because of the, as it were, scope of the historical memory, the cultural memory that's contained within these systems, its ability to put together and reconstruct is really quite profound. Now, what I'm therefore suggesting is that we're therefore moving beyond what Bernard Stiegler called grammatization. Grammatization was the notion that, in a sense, human culture has been a process of discretization, and the discretization in and of itself has been a very powerful form of cultural development over the past thousands of years. And grammatization in the digital age has been increasingly associated with a certain kind of question around technical recording and storage. And of course, Frederick Kittler speaks to that in very interesting ways. Now, in contrast, I want to suggest that we now confront what I call diffusionization. And diffusionization is radically different to grammatization, because where grammatization was essentially the cutting up into digital fragments, as it were, diffusionization actually practically dissolves culture. And in the dissolving of culture and its storage, or its embedding within certain kinds of latent spaces within neural networks, what we get is a very strange possibility of the intercombination and transformation of cultural form through a reconstitutional process, which is probabilistically generated. Which means that, and we've seen this, of course, with the way in which various forms of LLMs, and particularly image LLMs, work, they're able to bring together elements of cultural history, for example, in ways that have never been seen before, may never have been thought about, may be shocking, may be interesting, may be very creative in various ways. And this move from a kind of computational turn, that is one around digitalization and the use of computational methods, etc., to the synthetic turn, where we are at the kind of nascent development of diffusionization as both a productive method of cultural production, but also in terms of diffusionational methods for generative purposes. I think this is a very important moment for us to consider. Now, what's fascinating, I think, is that for Stiegler, the symbolic is really important in the element of this discretization and formalization process. And of course, he uses language as his example. But in diffusionization, we don't use the symbolic in terms of language, for example. We use tokens. We use small, actually often quite ahuman or inhuman shaped cultural objects, cultural elements, cultural shards, if you like, that produces and again, it's very interesting because we don't really have the language to discuss this, but essentially it's a kind of a database, but not a database in the computational sense of a database, but more of a kind of space of possibility within a network of weights spread across a neural network. And what this does is it allows the network to essentially generate what we might think of as synthetic variations. And these synthetic variations can bring together elements from across the network in very interesting and challenging ways. So this is the possibility of a departure from our traditional notions of computational paradigms. And I'm suggesting that actually what we're moving from is a kind of a deterministic notion of usage of computation to a probabilistic one. Now, of course, computers always had the possibility of probabilistic function, but the reliance on the grammatization process meant that the way in which they worked was within a certain bounded range of deterministic outputs, which really means that with a certain kind of input, you would expect a certain kind of output from these systems. But with probabilistic systems, it's very hard to know what will come out of a particular configuration or input because of this kind of novel, deep probabilism that lies within the network. Now, a concrete way of thinking about this is the transition from Photoshop to Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, for example, where you see it's not merely an add-on to existing ways of doing. It's actually a transformation in the creative workflow, where you are no longer in direct manipulation, for example, of pixels through computational methods selected through interfaces, but actually a kind of strangely mediated interface through, at the moment, of course, it's textual prompts, but I suspect that will change to a different form, to produce a kind of usage of generative processes to essentially shape and generate an image. Now, this gives you a very concrete example of what this can look like. On the left, you see a human industrial object. It's actually a cable support component, which is incredibly strong. But when you run this through an artificial intelligence and allow the artificial intelligence to just work through both the mathematics of the physics of the object, but also allow it the freedom to interrelate the object with other kinds of objects that might also perform a similar but different function, what you get is a movement from these kinds of clearly discrete human-formed industrial objects to the object on the right there, which is barely recognizable as our notion of a cable support component, and yet is far stronger and more efficient in usage, and of course more efficient in materials and production, etc. So this notion of diffusionization is not just one of surface, and it's certainly not just one of media. I think it will touch all of production. Now, synthetic media itself, the notion of synthetic media has been popularized from around sort of 2017, particularly with the rise of deepfakes and the use of various forms of photo editing, essentially to create either what's called fake media or artificial media. And the notion of synthetic emphasizes, I think, the constructed nature of the content, the way in which it seems to bring together and merge various forms of cultural objects in interesting and new ways. Now, synthetic media is to be distinguished. As you can see, I'm drawing this strong distinction between the computational and the diffusional. So, for example, what we see is in traditional edited media using computation, you would use various forms of computational techniques. But with the diffusional synthetic media, what you see is novel content rather than, for example, taking an existing photo and slightly editing it. You can actually generate an image from scratch. And this notion of synthetic media, I think, is interesting because it captures, I think, some of the elements of the generative that's very important for us to keep at the forefront of our minds. For example, the notion that the synthetic, which comes from the Greek synthetikos, which is essentially to put together or compose, and of course media in terms of the artificially composed or manufactured or edited. So we get this very, I think, useful term, synthetic media, that has this compositional element to it in terms of a particular kind of media content. Now, the key characteristics of synthetic media, of course, are that they're produced by these AI machine learning systems, particularly by LLM systems, the large language models, but any kind of tokenizing system that uses this function of latent space and diffusional techniques. We have seen over the past 3 years a remarkable increase in the resolution of these systems and the increased fidelity of these systems. We are at, I think, a turning point in terms of, for example, student essays are increasingly undetectable as artificial intelligence generated content. Photographs are increasingly moving in that direction. Of course, the latest video diffusional technologies produce incredible at the moment, short-form video using these techniques. They can be applied to media as well as producing wholly fabricated media. They have this kind of whole range of possibility. And often, of course, they are trained on vast data sets. Most of them are trained on, for example, the entire library of books in Google Books. They can also use various forms of pirated systems. So we learned recently that Meta actually trained its Llama LLM purely on pirated books, which it considered were worthless, and is currently in the middle of a court case around this. And synthetic media, of course, covers a whole range of media forms, visual, audio, text, and various forms increasingly of multimodal combinations. So it's a very extensive notion. Now, the systems that make technical media possible, of course, generative AI systems, we've talked about those. Increasingly, adversarial networks are used that increase the quality by rather interestingly using John Nash's mathematics to produce neural networks in competition. These diffusional systems that essentially generate content from noise, and of course the statistical patterns that are used in large language models. Together with these are various deep learning techniques that we're becoming very familiar with very quickly. So neural networks, of course, allowing complex pattern recognition, feature analysis, style analysis, etc. Transfer learning, and this is very important, the ability to take these, for example, style features from one domain of knowledge and apply it to another, which is absolutely fascinating. So you could, for example, ask ChatGPT to write in the style of Thomas Hardy or another author. It can turn prose into poetry and poetry into prose quite easily. Not necessarily always competently, particularly with the current methods, but you can see, of course, the direction of travel. And I think also very importantly is these models, general models, but increasingly called world models, can also be fine-tuned. So we're seeing the introduction of context windows as kind of a big area of research in this area, where you can actually shape and constrain the possibility of these generative systems. And I think when students understand this technology a little bit more, we're going to see a real problem here, because they can essentially upload all of their essays they've written, and then the computers from then on can use style analysis and transfer learning to essentially produce essays in their written style on any subject whatsoever. So very interesting techniques. Just to come to some of the interesting kind of issues that get raised by this, I think, is of course the huge amounts of data that are required to do so. I've already talked to the fact that they're using, the 26 million books in Google Books, but also Z Library and as archive. They also massively use social media. So Reddit has been one of the kind of key sources of conversational analysis. Audio data, video data, image data, huge amounts of content. I'm just going to point to, though I probably won't have time to talk about, the copyright infringement implications of this are huge. A lot of these systems have essentially taken copyright material without permission. Of course, they have massive compute requirements. We read increasingly about the way in which these systems are extremely costly in terms of electricity, physical components, and so on and so forth. And of course, they're increasingly being put together in new what are called sparse networks, which are complicated architectures that allow them to bring together multimodal media systems. You can see the beginnings of this, I think, in ChatGPT, where you're able to ask ChatGPT to draw images. And what's happening there is two big AI systems are essentially being conjoined into these sparse network systems. Now, as I said at the very beginning, deepfakes have been an important part of this. Deepfakes were essentially the beginnings of creating fake content that, for example, could be used in political campaigns, could be used in non-consensual celebrity face swapping. There's a big controversy over that. But increasingly, they're also able to capture facial movements, expressions, and even voice synchronization. I haven't got time to show you the videos, but there are some really incredible uses of these new technology in able to not just create static fake images, but actually moving images with very realistic voice. So we see in image synthesis, for example, a whole variety of systems have been launched. DALL-E 3 actually came out a couple of weeks ago, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, etc. And if you haven't had a chance to play with these technologies, I really do recommend you do so. They're quite addictive. They're very interesting in the way in which they also pitch the systems. So if you compare, for example, DALL-E 3 with Stable Diffusion, you'll see the differences in both quality. Stable Diffusion is far more sophisticated, far more complicated, but DALL-E produces let's say, more workable images, but far simpler to do so. So here, for example, some examples of the kind of synthetic media, and just to show you the kind of quality we're looking at. Pope Francis, of course, who passed away just last week. But here we see him kind of reconstituted within a fashionable coat. And this image really circulated around social media in quite a remarkable way. But it's completely AI generated, and it's very, very difficult actually to detect the AI aspects of it. And also in terms of audio, musicians are increasingly finding themselves also being automated. So here we have this combination of Drake and The Weeknd put together by an AI system. And again, this caught a lot of attention just because the quality of the audio, the quality of the rapping and the voice synthesis and so on and so forth. Very fascinating. And this creates a whole dimension for us that's going to be extremely problematic. We've got, of course, non-consensual creation. We have the problem, I think, in terms of politics and politicians being misrepresented. We saw this in the Trump election with Biden, fake video circulating, fake voice talks circulating and so on and so forth. I think that's just going to get much more intense. We're, of course, getting new forms of harassment and image-based abuse. I think that's going to be a running problem in our political systems. And, of course, the misinformation and disinformation sides of this, where we see the misrepresentation of events, the creation of events that have never happened, and, of course, the difficulty of verification, so a sort of verification crisis emerging. And leading us into, obviously, traditional media problems, the problems, of course, of the distortion of the media landscape, the flooding of information, what I termed the inversion, the underlying of trust in authentic media organizations, of course, information overload and the overloading of these verification systems like the media. And a good example of this, I think, is the synthetic Putin and Zelensky videos that were circulated early on in the Ukraine conflict. The famous video asking for surrender by Zelensky, which was circulated on social media within the Ukraine. And the difficulty really, not just of the detection of these things, which often circulate through private media, but also the kind of debunking systems that are required for them. So we're going to see these, I think, increasingly as a problem. Now, how can we react to these issues? This is just to talk to some of those questions of really kind of resistance, but also regulation. Clearly, there is a big problem of the rise of this kind of media, sometimes called AI slop, which essentially pushes out human-created media and actually undermines content moderation systems because of the ability of these systems to be manipulated very, very quickly. So we see talk of, for example, influencer videos being generated where one influencer might have produced one very high quality version, and LLM can generate 5,000 versions, each with a slight variation to maximize the algorithms within platforms like YouTube. So there's been a push towards a requirement for synthetic media labeling, notably in China, actually. But the EU, of course, is also interested in increasing this labeling requirement. I suspect in America this will fall off the political agenda. Legislative approaches, of course, as well. So we see the EU AI Act, the US Defiance Act, and also, of course, China's 2023 regulations. And of course, to some extent, I'm rather dubious about this, but certain forms of self-regulation, of course, the AI responsible practices for synthetic media partnership, and various other forms of voluntary watermarking that are allegedly going to be implemented by major AI companies. With the change in leadership in America, I'm not sure that any of the Silicon Valley companies are going to massively buy up to this, but we shall see. So what should we do about this? Well, just to bring this talk to a close, I think you won't be surprised that I advocate a critical reflexivity. I advocate various new forms of educational and digital literacy campaigns. We really need to be aware of how these systems are operating. We certainly need to be teaching children to be much more skeptical of media and skeptical of the way in which synthetic media is becoming part of our media landscape. I think increasingly we're going to have to think about these subsumption practices, the way in which automation will lead to mass unemployment, and taking humans out of the loop of creativity and production, even in realms that we never really considered them to be able to do so. For example, in paralegal and legal contexts, economic contexts, but of course media production more generally, as these systems become better and better at producing various forms of multimedial production. I think we should think about this in terms of explainable forms of life. We need to think more about how we can expect the systems themselves to explain to us what they're doing and how they're doing. This is increasingly called mechanistic interpretability. I think it's a very important part of this dimension, and I've written a few papers on explainable forms of life that I do recommend you have a look at. And connecting these really to the traditional questions of critical theory around human flourishing and how we are able to increase people's quality of life, and the notion of human flourishing under the algorithmic condition, I think, is absolutely crucially important. And one note, of course, the connection of computational capitalism in this synthetic moment, the diffusional form of media, linked with surveillance capital is extremely dangerous. Surveillance capital, of course, Zubov's notion. How can we adapt our political economies to be able to have more appropriate forms of uses of these technologies? And that's my talk. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for your speech and for your participation, Professor Berry. And it was a great opportunity to listen to you. And finally, would you like to say something more about something to audiences?
Something
to audiences, our audiences. Yes.
To your audience?
Yes. Would you like to say something more?
What I would suggest is that I think there's a research program desperately needed around synthetic media.
Yeah.
I think the problematic of the synthetic is going to be one that is going to be hitting all of our societies. So for the media researchers amongst you, I think this might be something to consider as a serious research program. Particularly this notion of diffusionization, I recommend you to look at my recent paper on synthetic media and computational capitalism that was recently published in AI and Society, where I sort of draw out the development of a research program around this. I think this notion of diffusionization, I think, is quite interesting in terms of, rethinking the way in which we understand computation and computational effects in society. So I think I would really suggest that your audience, which is obviously made up of a range of different people from different sectors, etc., but I think that would be something that I would consider very important for all of them to consider.
Okay. Thank you very much again. And we sent you all with graduate, and we hope to see you. We hope to welcome you in Istanbul very soon. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Değerli konuklarımız, bütün keynote konuşmacılarımıza çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Bugünün anısına kendisine plaketini vermek üzere öncelikli olarak İletişim Fakültesi Dekanımız Profesör Doktor Aybüke Serttaş'ı sahneye davet ediyorum. Ve plaketini almak üzere de keynote speaker'ımız Profesör Doktor Cem Sefa Sütçü'yü de sahneye rica ediyorum. Hocam da geldi. Hocam biz teşekkür ederiz. Ağzınıza sağlık. Vaktinizi ayırdınız. Sağ olun. Değerli konuklarımız, açılış oturumumuz burada sona ermiştir. Saat 1.30'da başlayacak olan online oturumda tekrar görüşmek üzere. Teşekkürler, hoşça kalın.